Today I'm going to talk about uh, one interesting fact that we always see headlines that dairy milk consumption is decreasing, and it sounds like a big fact and concerns to everyone. And um, we will use some consumer segmentation based on people's consumption behavior and try to see what does that mean for other major dairy products like cheese down the road. So um, I forgot to put my professor's name, Dr. Zifeng Gao, who is also working in this project, who is my PhD supervisor. So I apologize for that, but let's talk about the main thing. So in this talk, I'll give you some motivation or background data related to the market context, and the dairy beverage, especially related to that. And then what are the research gaps that we see in this regard, and what are the key findings that we get from this research, and eventually the implications for the industry. So this is a bit older data, but that shows that, okay, our per capita white milk consumption is decreasing. But at the same time, if you look at the yellow colored thing, that's the plant-based product. So it's increasing steadily, and it is still increasing, but this is probably a correlation, but not the causation. I don't want to argue about that. So we are seeing a trend here that fluid milk consumption is definitely decreasing nationwide, but at the same time, plant-based milk is increasing. But is it a big concern? So when I first encountered this issue, it felt a big issue to me. But when I look at the composition of the milk that goes to different industries, only 18% of our milk goes to the fluid milk, and more than 80% of our milk is being processed to different other products like cheese, yogurt, and many other stuff. So what is, and having said that, we can use consumer segmentation to understand people's declining milk beverage consumption behavior. So what is consumer segmentation? We can use different types of characteristics to understand those segmentation. For instance, demographic characteristics. Like I can see those who are male, female here, what are their possible ages. These are visible demographic characteristics. However, we do not see people's behavior directly, right? I don't know how much milk do you drink every day morning or in your daily life, whether it's plant-based or white milk, right? So when we get the data of people's consumption behavior, we can use those things for the segmentation too. And based on that, then we can create different segmentation using different statistical methods, and eventually those segmentation actually helps us to understand different business strategies or techniques that we can apply to market our product and understand the consumer behavior in different segments. So what do we know so far in literature? One of our renowned professor, Olf and colleague, published this paper in 2020 in Journal of Dairy Science, where they found three major segmentation. Dairy loyalists, those who always consume dairy white milk, they do not consume any other types of plant-based milk. Then plant-based loyalists, those who only consume plant-based milk but no other dairy products. And then a third segmentation they figured out, which is they called or framed as flexitarian. That means this consumer base goes back and forth between both types of beverage. And they also figured that probably plant-based milk has substituted is some sort of white milk in different types of consumption ways, or the way people consume these two beverage types. And they also recognize that there is considerable heterogeneity among those consumer bases. However, as they laid the foundation, but there is some blind spot left. Theoretically, that's which motivated me to look at this first, because if you look at this three segmentation, one of the major segmentation is missing, at least theoretically, that who do not consume anything at all, right? And when I reviewed that paper or read that paper, we see that they kind of used the scale which track people consumption in terms of fourth scale. That is, whether are you a regular consumer, are you a occasional consumers, something like this. So there is 4 scales, but this is pretty, the boundary could be very much limited, which could have prevent them to figure out the last segment that we are theoretically missing here. And when we understand this segmentation, what does that imply for our major dairy products like cheese? So I kind of thought that probably we should actually explore that too. So this is the segment that I was talking about. This is theoretically that last segment is missing here. So I'm going to ask you, like, who, which segment do you fit in? Who are dairy loyalists? Who only? Okay, you can look at the room and look who are the dairy loyalists. Okay. Who are more plant-based? No white milk. Plant-based. No, right? And yeah, this is important. Remark that. No, almost no one, right? And why? We'll talk about that. And who are flexitarian? Okay, beautiful. And anyone with low involvement, no milk at all? Me, kind of. Okay. Okay, so my research objectives are pretty much given. So I want to revisit the consumer segmentation based on the older studies and see how these segmentation size differs when if there is new segmentation emerge from there, and then link it with the cheese demand or cheese consumption pattern. So for this, we collected almost 2,136 nationally representative sample. This is a quota sample, so in our survey, we kind of strictly maintain those quota that fits the census. So these consumers come from a representative survey. So instead of 4 scale, we adopted a 8 scale one where we ask more about people's consumption frequency rather than asking a very much more qualitative question whether you are a regular consumer or not. So we asked whether do you consume more than once a day, or are you a daily consumer, more than once a week, or a weekly consumer, something like that. So that gives us 8-point scale. So when we put this into the clustering method to find the optimal cluster size, as you can see, if you look at this graph, if the value is higher, that means that clustering definition is fitting the data more. So that's an improvement. So you can see that when we use 2 cluster, it's pretty lower, around 2,000. When you use 3, pretty similar. But when you use 4 clustering, the index probably jumped pretty good. That means that fits the data, and I was expecting, like, there should be 4 cluster, at least theoretically, not 3. And then if we move further, I see 6 cluster instead of 4. So I'll talk about them more when I move to the results section. So probably there is a 6 cluster. Probably they will fit in 4 cluster. Let's see how it works. So the first cluster we identified that also fits the earlier study, dairy loyalist. They're 44% of the total consumer. And among them, 18.8% on an average, 19% are pure loyalists. They're premium loyalists. They almost consume white milk almost every day. And then there is another moderate loyalist who, this is a big portion, almost 1 out of 4 of our sample fits in this category. So these cluster only consumed white milk. They do not consume any plant-based milk. Then we also have flexitarian, which they're 1/3 of our sample. And in this class, we also have 2 classes. One is premium flexitarian. They pretty much consume both types of beverage in more regular basis. And then we have a balanced flex, which consumption frequency is a bit lower. This is the third segmentation that we also identified, similar to the earlier studies, plant-based, which is only 9%. That means these consumers only consume plant-based milk. The group that we missed in our previous studies, this is the low involvement group. They're about 13.5%. So they really exist, but previous study couldn't identify them. So mm, according to the theory, we kind of seeing those four major segments, and then within the larger segments, we see some sub-segments of the consumer. Okay. So if you compare these distribution compared to the earlier studies, you can see that earlier study reported that dairy loyalists are 62%. However, we find that they're 44%. So they're not, our dairy loyalist base is not that big. Then plant-based, it was reported that it is 23%. However, our study find that this is only 9% of the consumer fits in plant-based consumer segmentation. But in earlier studies, they reported 15% flexitarian, but we find that they are much bigger, 33%. And one of the group that's missing in the earlier studies, which is low involvement group, around 14%. So that's how the distribution looks like according to our national US data. And who are those people? So if we look at the by the demographic characteristics, those who raised your hand when I asked who are the dairy loyalists, do you see yourself there? Age is around 50. So age is at a bit higher level. Their weekly food expenditure is less than $200. More female fits in this class according to our data, because when I looked at the raw data, we see that female drink dairy milk more regularly than male. But I'm not sure about the statistical significance there. And they have some college degree, Midwest and South. These are the regions heavy. And I also had a data that collected their political orientation, so leaning to the Republican side a bit, but that's not a major concern. So flexitarian, these are more younger people. And when I asked, like, who are the flexitarian, very few people raise their hand, because we don't have a very good representation of that group in our room, probably, right? We don't see too much. So 18 to 34 years, these are the major flexitarian group, almost 42%. High food expenditure, gender balance to male, highly educated, mostly with bachelor degrees, higher income, more urban oriented, and mixed of Republican and Democrat political orientation. Those who are low involvement, that's interesting. Again, those who are a bit on the older side, they also avoid all types of milk. And their food expenditure is lower, female majority, lower income, some college, mostly independent. And those who are plant-based, this is also kind of interesting. These are also young population, moderately spending on weekly basis, female majority, some college or bachelor degree. They're most leaning to the west side of the country, and Democrats mostly. So these are the basic demographic characteristics of this segmentation of the dairy beverage consumers. Now, what does that mean for the cheese consumption? So you also ask whether you consume cheese on the same scale of consumption frequency. You can see that what is interesting that we find that those who are flexitarian, they leads the cheese consumption. That I didn't expect, because I thought those who go to the plant-based milk more, probably they will avoid cheese, but it shows that flexitarians are the leading cheese consumer. And also the premium loyalists are too. Milk loyalists too. That means those who are also consuming a lot of dairy milks, they're also a major consumer of cheese. And if you compare that difference between these two numbers, there is no statistical significance of this difference. So these two major group, they almost consume a very similar frequency of cheese. And then within those two major groups, we have two groups, balanced flexitarian and moderately milk loyalists. Their consumption is also similar. There is no statistical significance. However, when we look at these two groups as a flexitarian and premium loyalist, we see that the difference is significant. That means those who are in flexitarian group, they consume statistically more cheese compared to the dairy loyalist group. And the rest of the two groups, plant-based and low involvement, they have very occasional cheese consumption. And this is pretty low. And this difference is also statistically insignificant. That means their consumption frequency is also similar. So what are the implications for the cheese industry? Wisconsin is one of the major cheese producing states, and I see that if someone is actually buying plant-based milk, we should not discount that consumer. We should market to that consumer more heavily, because though they're buying plant-based milk, they could be a major portion of the flexitarian consumer, right? So they could be our major target. And if we look at their consumption frequency, they're the highest consumer. They're consuming cheese more frequently. So probably we don't have the room to increase the frequency of their cheese consumption. But if we offer more variety and taste and functionality, probably they can buy more of those cheese. That's where the marketing strategy could work better. And the growth strategy actually comes to those moderate flexitarian and those who are kind of on the moderate side of the white milk drinker. So they have a bit room to increase their frequency, and that could be one of the strategies to increase our cheese selling growth. And for the low involvement group, I see that the age and their avoidance could have some structural pattern, probably the lactose intolerance, even though I'm not a very much learned person about that, but when I search in internet, it says that cheese do not have nothing to do with lactose tolerance. Probably you guys can confirm that. So lactose-free cheese could be one of the strategy for this low consumer group, but we have to consider that how much money we're investing to convert this consumer into the cheese consumer, and whether the return of investment makes sense. So based on this, we find that there are actually major 4 groups of segmentation in beverage milk market, not 3. And especially if we look finer group, there are 6 groups. And 3 tier cheese demand, very high, moderate, and very low. These are the 3 types of cheese demand that we see based on the fluid milk consumption pattern. And then again, the fluid milk declining consumption doesn't apply to the other dairy products, and we are actually cheese production data also confirms that. And based on this segmentation, we definitely have actionable marketing strategy for the cheese producer. And having said that, I'll end my talk today. If you have any question, I'd like to answer that. And I would also like to acknowledge NIFA's grant to support this research. Thank you very much.